Hello, my name is Sarah Dance. Today I'll be presenting on the diversity of wild rice wetlands in the Great Lakes region, the key drivers of those variations, and implications for research, management, and restoration. Starting with who wild rice is an annual aquatic macrophyte that produces an edible grain and is found almost exclusively in the Midwest wetlands. It has an annual life cycle, germinating in the spring and then dropping its seeds in the fall and dying. Seeds stay dormant in the sediment over the winter and germinate the following spring, restarting the cycle. It is not closely related to white rice. Wild rice is actually a highly nutritious grain that requires persistent flooded conditions in the root zone. In the Ojibwe language, it's called monoman. In the Dakota language, it's called sen. Wild rice is an incredibly ecologically and culturally significant being. For many indigenous people in the Great Lakes region, such as the Anishinaabe and Dakota, they harvest wild rice as a traditional cultural practice each fall and have done so for centuries. The pictures here show how wild rice is harvested. Natives carve wild rice sticks, aka knockers, to knock rice that's ripe into canoes each fall. Wild rice is also a nursery, habitat, and food source for many other beings, including muskrats, geese, fish, and many other species. Like many other wetland plants, populations benefit their environments by stabilizing shorelines, uptaking and retaining nutrients and biomass, and immobilizing harmful contaminants at the root surface. Despite its outsized importance, wild rice populations are dramatically declining. The map on the left here shows the shift in wild rice watershed occurrence across Minnesota and Wisconsin watersheds between the early 1900s and 2000s. This paper estimated a 32% decline in watershed occurrence, with the most significant losses occurring in each state's southernmost region. The map on the right here shows wild rice bodies across state, treaty-ceded lands, and tribal lands in the 2000s. The reason for these declines are complex and interconnected, and they include climate change, land use change, and pollution. A core trait of natural wild rice populations is the vast genetic diversity of wild rice populations and habitats observed by indigenous people for centuries. They've long regarded rice that grows on lakes to produce few but large seeds, and rice that grows on the edges of rivers and streams with faster moving water to produce a larger number of smaller seeds. Wild rice also shows incredible variation across the same population at the same site in the same growing season. Some populations have greater root to shoot ratios, broader leaves, and mature at different rates. In coupled greenhouse and field experiments, wild rice populations exhibit unique responses to environmental pressures depending on their parent plant population. This poses three critical questions. What are the key drivers of these variations? What are the consequences? And how can wild rice research, management, and restoration account for these variations? Here, I've grouped 6 major drivers, but keep in mind all of these drivers are deeply interconnected. The first one I want to talk about are plant-related drivers. Wild rice exhibits strong phenotypic plasticity, meaning each plant can dynamically adapt to its environmental pressures within a predefined range determined by its parent plant. Natural selection is not mutually exclusive, as this plasticity can promote population shifts to adapt more readily to changing environmental conditions, but can also prevent populations from successfully surviving or colonizing a new location. Natural selection may also select for greater or diminished plasticity, but there isn't a lot of research on this topic for wild rice. Specific contributing traits include how wild rice is exclusively wind pollinated and experiences little genetic drift outside their parent population. As you can see in this picture on the bottom left, seeds are torpedo-shaped and have tiny grooves to embed into the sediment efficiently near the parent plant. They are not likely to be moved to another location. Seeds that drop the previous year are not necessarily the seeds that will germinate the following year. Wild rice seeds can stay dormant for many years, and certain pressures allow seeds that are just right to germinate each year. The picture on the right here is a wild rice location between 3 years with no significant changes in the environmental or climatic conditions. Wild rice is known to go through a 4-year boom-bust normal cycle, meaning that we'll have 1 year that is very successful, 1 year that is very poor, and then 2 years that are around a normal range. This is due to the decaying plant matter having different carbon to nitrogen ratios each year depending on the previous year's biomass accumulation. This cycling benefits wild rice habitats by promoting diverse ecosystem functions year to year. Water plays a massive role in these variations. Surface water levels determine how far wild rice needs to grow its stems before it can reach the surface to start a greater rate of photosynthesis. This promotes differences in lake and river habitats, but it also facilitates differences within habitats, as shown here in this graphic adapted from Meeker 1996. In the part A, you can see the environment before the germination. In part B, you can see the environment during the submerged stage, and then C is the emergent stage. And each of these, the blue dotted line, represent the measured velocity in meters per second. And you can see how that velocity is slowed as the plant population grows. Submerged and emergent stages, decreasing the velocity of that moving water helps to promote the deposition of potentially nutrient-rich sediment. Upwelling can also provide nutrients to waters with less surface water flow. Additionally, water clarity is critical for photosynthesis in early life stages. Many of these water-related drivers have deeply interconnected feedback loops. The next driver that has diverse constituents is sediment. Sediment is partially materials weathering from underlying bedrock. Sediment is also decaying organic matter from previous plant and animal populations. Wild rice grows in a vast diversity of sediment types, but bulk density, sediment texture, and organic matter content can control population dynamics considerably. These black and white graphics here show the extreme differences between sediment particles and how those particle sizes impact pore sizes and how pore water has the ability to move through those spaces quickly. As previously mentioned, wild rice has a hold on its internal nitrogen cycling, but iron concentrations also play a role. And the picture here on the bottom left, this is an experiment done on another plant where they actually increased the concentration of iron available to the plant. You can see with increasing iron concentration availability and increased deposition of iron oxide plaques on the root surface. These iron oxide plaques help to contribute to plant nutrient uptake, contaminant mobilization, and diverse microbiology in the rooting zone. Other drivers can include climate, daylight length and intensity, temperatures, and pH. However, wild rice can grow across a wide diversity of even these conditions. The absence or presence of other species is also a factor. The picture on the bottom left shows a caged-off wild rice stand at a site overgrazed by fish. An essential component of this story is how the indigenous people in the Great Lakes region manage wild rice. Many communities see wild rice as a being not to be manipulated with and did not move seed populations from specific sites before colonization. They practice sustainable and careful harvesting practices and continue to do so today. One might ask, why do these variations exist? How are they beneficial? They improve population resiliency and its survival strategies. Wild rice depends on fluctuating diverse conditions. Compared to monotypical agriculture, broad genetic diversity promotes disease tolerance and prevents mass die-off in extreme weather events. Many of these variations are enacted due to environmental pressures, but monomen also shapes its environment in creating complex feedback loops. Wild rice is one of the only emergent aquatic plants with an annual life cycle native to the region. So these adaptations support diverse wetlands. These variations create challenges for research. When doing field research, it's challenging to just sample a few sites and make any meaningful comparisons. The picture on the right is a sampling site map for a substantial wild rice sampling survey done by UMN researchers. It took over sampling 100 habitats multiple times a year across several years with over 64 physical and chemical variables collected to elucidate meaningful relationships between wild rice population occurrence and environmental conditions. As far as mesocosm and greenhouse experiments, these results have limited outcomes because of the heterogeneity of wild rice populations within and across habitats. They don't capture how dynamic most wild rice environments are and how the feedback between plants, water, and sediment shape long-term population health. Unfortunately, for many reseeding efforts, they tend to be unsuccessful in the short and long term. Seeds grown in nurseries or taken from other locations may have adapted to environmental conditions too different from the new site selected. It takes 2 to 5 years of consistent reseeding with the same parent plant population to succeed in many cases. A rapidly changing climate and landscape complicate things, and hardier plant species dominating wetlands poses a considerable challenge. For example, cattails are notoriously difficult to remove. Many indigenous communities hold site-specific knowledge of wild rice habitats from previous generations. Ongoing settler violence that killed, forcibly removed, and traumatized indigenous people contributed to a loss of this valuable knowledge. This trauma includes the boarding school many Ojibwe children were forced to go to and not allowed to speak their language or practice cultural traditions. How are ways that we can account for this viability moving forward? Well, we can start with examining seeds for reseeding and selecting seeds that are more similar to their parent population to the site that's being selected. We can also select seeds that are more resilient to anthropogenic stressors, but there must be an effort to preserve the genetic diversity for long-term success. Sites have to be evaluated and managed individually. It's too difficult to make meaningful recommendations for management when doing a study across a wide range of wild rice stands in most cases. For scientists, effective science communication and research result dissemination are critical. There is so much complexity and uncertainty in these environments. Building trust with communities is ineffective by promising precise research results. Instead, emerging fields of knowledge and risk communication during environmental disasters highlights how expanding our understanding of uncertainty as something inevitable and something that we can embrace instead of trying to limit it through scientific inquiry can yield greater outcomes for disaster preparedness across many scales. These scales including political, organizational, societal, and even individual. Finally, there needs to be accountability for how we conduct this research and communicate it to stakeholders and communities. This leads to the crucial collaborations across the academy, across fields of ecology, plant biology, biogeochemistry, hydrology, microbiology, geography, social science, psychology, communication, and many more areas. More importantly, it includes outside of the academia with natural resource managers, environmental organizations, community leaders, and community members. These collaborations can take years to build up effectively, but can have enormous payoffs for ethical co-production of knowledge that is more likely to protect and restore Mahnomen. In conclusion, wild rice habitat variability contributes to its resiliency and sensitivity in the face of a changing climate and landscape. These factors are profoundly interconnected and challenging to delineate. Regardless, university and government actors should ethically pursue the protection and restoration of wild rice and their individual and organizational capacity. Science never has and will never be isolated from political, social, and historical factors. Protecting and restoring wild rice and the Great Lakes region will be one of the greatest environmental challenges we face in the coming decades, but it is a fight worth continuing to save this incredible being named Mahnomen. And then I want to share some resources here for people to learn more. Theways.org has a really great video that centers Indigenous voices about Mahnomen. This website below, GWOW, has a great overview with a plain language. And then the UMN Mahnomen project, which I'm a part of, it's a really great example of ethical collaborations and why I came to the university. And then these two organizations here do a lot of restoration and protection work with tribal nations. And then two books I want to recommend here is Wild Rice and the Ojibwe People and Mahnomen, the Story of Wild Rice in Michigan. And two Indigenous authors I want to encourage everyone to look up and see their writings about Mahnomen is Dr. Kyle White and the famous advocate Winona LaDuke. And these are the sources that I used and cited. Thank you so much for your time.